In a peaceful suburban neighborhood, an elderly woman named Mrs. Caldwell went for her daily walk in the park. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was crisp and fresh. She was used to these quiet walks, enjoying the serenity of the park and the sounds of the birds chirping in the trees. Her life had slowed down significantly after her husband passed away, and now she lived alone in a large house. The walks had become her way of finding peace and connecting with her memories of happier times. On this particular day, as Mrs. Caldwell strolled along the path near the fountain, something unusual caught her eye. A young black boy was playing on the swings. He was laughing and running around with so much joy that Mrs. Caldwell couldn't help but smile. But then, as she looked at him more closely, she froze. The boy had the same bright smile, the same mischievous glint in his eyes, and the same playful expression that reminded her of someone very special. The boy's features were so strikingly familiar, she couldn't ignore it. He looked just like her son Michael when he was young. Mrs. Caldwell stood there for a moment, watching the boy with a mix of curiosity and confusion. She couldn't quite place why he reminded her so much of Michael. Her son, now an adult and successful businessman, had grown up to be quite different from the carefree child he once was. She hadn't seen him in years, as he had become busy with work and his own family, and she couldn't help but miss the days when he used to run around like this young boy. She decided to take a few steps closer, still unsure of what she was feeling. Mrs. Caldwell couldn't shake the sense that something was significant about this encounter. It wasn't just the resemblance. It was something deeper, an unspoken connection that she couldn't explain. As she neared the boy, she smiled at him and asked gently, "Hello there, little one. What's your name?" The boy looked up at her and, with a shy smile, responded, "Tyler." "Tyler, that's a lovely name," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice warm. She knelt down to his level, trying to make him feel comfortable, although she was still reeling from the odd familiarity. "How old are you, Tyler?" "I'm 8, he said, looking up at her with wide eyes, as though he was unsure why an older woman would be asking him about his age. Mrs. Caldwell's heart softened at the sight of his innocent face. Still, something nagged at her mind. There was no mistaking it. This boy looked like Michael when he was a child. Could it be a coincidence, or was there a deeper connection? She pushed the thought aside for a moment and asked, "Do you live around here, Tyler?" The boy nodded. "Yeah, I live just around the corner with my mom." Mrs. Caldwell's thoughts raced as she processed his answer. Her heart skipped a beat as a thought crossed her mind. Could this child be somehow connected to her son? She had to know more, but how could she ask without sounding strange or intrusive? She didn't know what she was expecting, but the resemblance was enough to make her feel like there was a bigger story here, one that she was only beginning to uncover. The next day, Mrs. Caldwell found herself walking the same path to the park again. She couldn't shake the memory of little Tyler. His face had been haunting her thoughts all night. The way he looked so much like Michael when he was young. It was more than just coincidence. She couldn't ignore the strange feeling that there was something more to the story. As she walked through the park, Mrs. Caldwell kept her eyes peeled for the boy. She had to know more about him. She had no real reason to feel this way, but her heart urged her to reach out. There was something about him that felt important, something that stirred up emotions she thought she had buried long ago. When she reached the park, she noticed Tyler again. This time, he was sitting with a woman on one of the benches, a woman she hadn't seen before. The woman was young and looked like she was in her late 20s or early 30s. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she was wearing a simple blouse and jeans. She looked up as Mrs. Caldwell approached, offering a warm, welcoming smile. "Good morning." Mrs. Caldwell greeted them as she walked over. "I was wondering if I could talk to you for a moment." The woman seemed surprised at first, but smiled politely. "Of course," she said. "Is everything okay?" "I'm sorry to bother you, but I couldn't help but notice your son," Mrs. Caldwell began. She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "He looks so much like my son when he was a child. His name is Michael. and he's all grown up now. But I just had to ask, could he be related to me? The woman looked at her for a moment, as though trying to decide whether or not she should share more. Finally, she nodded slowly. My name is Rachel, she said. Tyler's father. Well, he's Michael's cousin. Mrs. Caldwell's heart stopped. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Tyler was related to her son, Michael. The revelation felt like a weight had been lifted off her chest, but also like a new mystery had just opened up. She had so many questions. How had this happened? Why had Michael never mentioned anything? And why hadn't she heard about this child sooner? Tyler is Michael's cousin's son, Rachel continued. I know this must be a lot to process. We've kept it a secret. There are things that Michael doesn't know about Tyler's birth, and I didn't want to complicate things, especially with Michael being so busy with his work and his life. But Tyler is Michael's family. Mrs. Caldwell was stunned. The boy, the one who looked so much like Michael, was indeed connected to him. But how? Why hadn't Michael mentioned it? Mrs. Caldwell couldn't stop herself from asking, why didn't he ever tell me about Tyler? Rachel hesitated before answering. It's a complicated story. Michael wasn't in a place to be a father at the time, and there were some things that happened that made it difficult for us to connect. But Tyler has always been a part of his family, even if Michael didn't know. Mrs. Caldwell felt her emotions stir as she processed everything. This was so much to take in, but one thing was clear. Tyler wasn't just a random boy in the park. He was family. And now Mrs. Caldwell knew she had to find a way to bring Tyler into Michael's life, whether he knew it or not. This was the moment she had been waiting for, and she knew she couldn't let it slip away. Mrs. Caldwell could hardly believe what she had just learned. Tyler, the little boy she had seen in the park, was connected to her son, Michael. The resemblance between the two was uncanny, and it felt as though something inside her clicked into place. But as she stood there with Rachel, all she could think about was how to make sure Michael knew about Tyler and what his future might hold now that this secret was out. After their conversation in the park, Mrs. Caldwell couldn't shake the feeling of urgency. She had spent so many years keeping her son close, watching over him as he built his successful life. Michael had always been her world, and now it seemed there was a part of his life she had missed. She needed to tell him. She needed him to know that he had a family he didn't even know about. That afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell made her way back to her house. She knew that it would be difficult to get Michael to understand what was going on, but she had to try. She couldn't keep this from him any longer. She called her son's phone several times, but each time she was met with voicemail. Michael was busy, she knew that. He was always on the move, managing his companies, attending meetings, and traveling around the world. But this was important. She had to get through to him. She sat down on the couch, feeling the weight of the situation. She didn't know how to start, but she knew that the truth had to come out. She decided to try again later and set her phone down. For the next few hours, she couldn't stop thinking about Tyler. She thought about how much this little boy needed a father figure in his life, how much he deserved to know who his real family was. Then, at about 7:00 p.m., the phone rang. It was Michael. Mrs. Caldwell quickly answered. "Mom, what's going on?" Michael's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he sensed something was different. "Michael, we need to talk. It's about something important," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice shaking just a little. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. "Sure, Mom. What is it?" Michael responded, though his tone was still filled with concern. "Michael, I met a little boy today. His name is Tyler. And Michael, he looks just like you when you were his age. I've been thinking about this for hours, and I need you to know something." There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment. Mrs. Caldwell knew this was going to be a lot for her son to process. "Tyler, he's your cousin's son, Michael. He's related to you, and you have a family connection that you didn't know about. Tyler is family, and I need you to understand how important it is for you to meet him." The silence on the other end of the line stretched on, and Mrs. Caldwell's anxiety grew. She could hear Michael's breath, but there was no immediate response. "Mom, I don't know what to say," Michael finally responded. "How did this happen? Why didn't I know about him?" Mrs. Caldwell sat back, gathering her thoughts. This was the moment she had feared and hoped for. She could feel her heart racing, but she had to keep going. "There are things, Michael, things that have been hidden for a long time. Tyler's mother, Rachel, didn't want to disrupt your life or cause trouble. But the truth is, Tyler has been a part of your family from the beginning, and it's time for you to know him." She waited for her son's response, hoping he could find a way to accept this sudden revelation. The weight of the moment felt heavy, but Mrs. Caldwell knew this was only the beginning. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: things were about to change, and she would be there every step of the way to help Michael understand his new reality. The next few days were filled with a whirlwind of emotions for both Michael and Mrs. Caldwell. After their phone conversation, Michael had agreed to meet with Rachel and Tyler. It was hard for him to process the idea of having a young relative he had never known about, but he trusted his mother, and her words weighed heavily on his heart. Michael couldn't stop thinking about Tyler. He had a deep desire to see for himself if the boy really looked like him as his mother had said. He thought about his childhood and all the memories he had with his parents, and suddenly, a sense of responsibility grew in him. If this little boy truly was part of his family, he had to do the right thing. On the day of their meeting, Michael drove to the small park where Rachel and Tyler had been the other day. It was a warm afternoon, and the sun was shining brightly. As he pulled up, he spotted them right away. Tyler was playing in the grass, kicking a ball around with a big smile on his face. Rachel was sitting nearby on a park bench, watching him with a loving expression. Michael hesitated for a moment, standing outside his car. He could feel his heart beating a little faster. He didn't know what to expect. He had a lot of questions, but now wasn't the time to ask them all. His first priority was to meet Tyler and see if the resemblance was truly as strong as his mother had described. He slowly walked over to them, and as he got closer, Rachel stood up. She looked at him with a soft smile and an air of nervousness. Michael couldn't help but notice how much Tyler looked like a younger version of himself. The boy had his dark hair, his eyes, even the same way he tilted his head. He was undeniably his family. "Hi, Michael," Rachel said gently. "I'm glad you came. This is Tyler." Tyler looked up at Michael, a curious expression on his face. "Hi," he said, his voice soft but confident. Michael could see that Tyler had the same determination in his eyes that he had had as a child. There was no denying it now. This was his family. Michael knelt down to Tyler's level and smiled. "Hey there, buddy. It's nice to meet you." Tyler gave him a shy but warm smile in return. There was an awkward silence as they sized each other up, both trying to figure out what this meeting meant. Rachel stepped closer, sensing the tension between them. "Michael, I know this is a lot to take in," Rachel said, her voice calm. "I never wanted to keep him from you, but after everything that happened back then, I didn't know how to tell you." Michael took a deep breath and looked at Tyler. He could see the innocence in the boy's eyes, and it softened his heart. "It's okay," Michael said finally. I'm trying to understand all of this, but I'm glad to finally meet you, Tyler." Tyler seemed to relax a little, a shy but genuine smile spreading across his face. He held out his hand to Michael. "Are you my uncle now?" Michael chuckled softly, feeling a wave of emotion. "I think so. Yes, I am." From that moment on, things began to change for both Michael and Tyler. Michael took on a new role in Tyler's life, not just as a relative, but as someone who cared. He began visiting more frequently, bringing Tyler small gifts or taking him out for ice cream, trying to form a bond with the boy. There was still a lot for them to learn about each other, but Michael knew he had to be there for Tyler. This was just the beginning of their journey together, and Michael was determined to make the most of it. Rachel watched from the sidelines, grateful that Michael had embraced Tyler despite the difficult history. And Tyler, for the first time in his life, felt like he had found something that was missing: his family. As the weeks passed, Michael found himself growing more comfortable with his new role in Tyler's life. He had started to visit the boy regularly, sometimes just for a few hours after work, and sometimes on weekends when they would spend the whole day together. Rachel had been nothing but supportive, even though she still felt a bit unsure about how everything would unfold. She could tell that Michael was trying his best, and that meant everything to her. One Saturday, Michael invited Tyler to the park, just the two of them. He wanted to spend some one-on-one time with him, away from the distractions of the city and the noise of everyday life. Tyler was excited, bouncing around with his usual energy as Michael drove them to a nearby nature reserve. It was a place Michael had visited as a child with his own family, and he thought Tyler would enjoy it too. "Are we going to see the ducks?" Tyler asked eagerly, his eyes wide with excitement. "Maybe we'll see a few," Michael replied with a smile. "But we might also see some other animals too. It's a nice place to explore." As they arrived and stepped out of the car, Michael noticed how the sunlight seemed to make the place even more beautiful. The trees were lush and green, and the air was fresh, filled with the scent of nature. It was peaceful. Tyler ran ahead, laughing as he looked at all the trees, the flowers, and the birds flying overhead. Michael followed closely behind, enjoying the boy's enthusiasm. It was hard not to feel a deep sense of connection with Tyler, and that connection was growing stronger with every visit. Michael couldn't ignore how much Tyler resembled him, how his smile reminded him of his own childhood. But it wasn't just that. The bond they shared was forming in other ways too. Tyler had an easygoing, bright personality, and despite his past, he was learning to trust Michael. They spent the afternoon exploring, chatting about everything from school to the best flavors of ice cream. Tyler even made a game out of pointing out different kinds of flowers and trees, and Michael played along, making it into a mini competition. He found himself laughing more than he had in years. There was something special about the bond they were starting to build, and Michael knew he wanted to keep it going. As they sat on a bench to take a break, Tyler suddenly turned to Michael with a thoughtful look on his face. "Do you think I'll get to meet the rest of your family?" Tyler asked, his voice soft, but there was a hint of hope in it. Michael paused for a moment, surprised by the question. He hadn't really thought about it, but now that Tyler had brought it up, it felt important. "I think that's a good idea," Michael said, smiling warmly. "I'm sure they'd love to meet you. But we'll take it one step at a time. First, we just need to get to know each other better." Tyler nodded, accepting the answer with the maturity of someone far beyond his years. He seemed happy with the idea of taking things slow, and Michael was grateful for that. The rest of the afternoon was spent in a peaceful, quiet contentment. Michael realized that this was more than just a family reunion. It was the start of a new chapter in both of their lives. As they headed back to the car, Michael felt a strong sense of responsibility, not just for Tyler's future, but for the future of their relationship. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. He was determined to be the family that Tyler needed, and to help him grow into the person he was meant to be. As they drove home, Tyler, now quiet and thoughtful, gazed out of the window at the passing scenery. Michael couldn't help but feel proud. It wasn't just about the resemblance. They were building something real, something strong together. And that, Michael realized, was what truly mattered. The next few weeks passed quickly, and Michael found himself looking forward to his time with Tyler more and more. The relationship they were building felt natural, like it had always been meant to be this way. Every visit strengthened the bond between them, and Michael noticed small changes in Tyler that made him proud. He was starting to open up more, sharing his thoughts and feelings with Michael, which made him feel even more like a father figure in the boy's life. One evening, after a particularly fun weekend at the park, Tyler asked if he could come over to Michael's apartment for a sleepover. It wasn't a big deal, but to Tyler, it was a step toward building a more permanent connection. Michael hesitated for only a moment, but then he realized this was exactly what he wanted. It wasn't about rushing things. It was about showing Tyler that he was there for him, no matter what. "Sure, buddy," Michael said with a warm smile. "Let's make it a fun night." They spent the evening playing video games and watching movies. Tyler was fascinated by Michael's collection of old action figures and comics, something Michael had kept from his childhood. Tyler was delighted to look through them and ask questions about each one. Michael was more than happy to share the stories behind each item. That night, Tyler fell asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, his face relaxed and peaceful. Michael watched him for a moment, feeling the deep sense of fulfillment. He had always wanted children of his own, but life had never quite worked out that way. Now, with Tyler in his life, he realized that things didn't have to happen exactly how he'd imagined. This was better. The next morning, as Michael made pancakes in the kitchen, Tyler wandered in, still in his pajamas. He looked up at Michael, eyes shining. "You're a good guy, Mr. Michael," Tyler said, his voice soft but sincere. "I'm glad you're my friend." Michael turned around, surprised by the sincerity in Tyler's words. His heart swelled. It wasn't just about being a good guy. It was about being there for Tyler in a way that mattered. He was learning to be more than just a friend. He was becoming a mentor, a protector, a constant presence in Tyler's life. "I'm glad you're here, Tyler," Michael replied with a grin. "You're a special kid, and I'm lucky to know you." After breakfast, Michael took Tyler to the local community center. They spent the afternoon there, playing basketball and joining in on some of the center's activities. As they headed home later in the day, Tyler seemed even more at ease. His laughter was infectious, and Michael couldn't help but feel proud. During their ride back to Michael's apartment, Tyler asked a question that caught him off guard. "Do you think I'll ever meet my mom?" Tyler asked, his tone uncertain. Michael paused for a moment, unsure of what to say. He hadn't been in touch with Tyler's mother, but he knew how important she was to the boy. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he promised Tyler that he would support him, no matter what. "I think that's something you'll have to decide when you're ready," Michael said carefully. "But I'll always be here for you, no matter what happens." Tyler smiled, and Michael could see the trust in his eyes. He felt reassured, knowing that Tyler's journey was one that they would continue together. As they pulled into the parking lot, Michael realized that while there was still much to figure out, this bond, this family they were building, was the most important thing in his life. He had made a promise to be there for Tyler, and now, more than ever, he knew that he would keep that promise. The future was uncertain, but together, they would face it, one step at a time.